In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, the most beautiful of stories. There are narratives in human history that capture the imagination, stir the soul, and leave an impression that lasts a lifetime. But there is one story, preserved in the words of Allah Himself, that stands apart from all others in its completeness, its depth, and its breathtaking movement from the darkest depths of despair to the highest heights of divine triumph. Allah did not merely mention this story in passing. He dedicated an entire surah of the Quran to it. And he opened that surah with a declaration that has echoed through 14 centuries of Islamic scholarship and devotion. In Surah Yusuf, Allah says, "We relate to you the best of stories in what we have revealed to you of this Quran. Although you were before it among the unaware, the best of stories, not one of the best, not among the finest, the best." And at the center of this story stands a young man whose life was a perfect demonstration of what it means to trust Allah completely, to remain pure in the face of corruption, to be patient in the face of injustice, and to forgive in the face of betrayal. His name is Yusuf, and his story begins not with triumph, but with a dream. The blessed son of a blessed father. He was the son of Prophet Yaqub, the grandson of Prophet Ishaq, and the great-grandson of Prophet Ibrahim, the friend of Allah. He came from a lineage that Allah Himself described as chosen, a family in which prophethood, faith, and divine favor had flowed from generation to generation like a river that never runs dry. From the very beginning of his life, there was something different about Yusuf. His character was gentle, his nature was pure, and his connection to Allah was evident even in his childhood years. He was the kind of child who sought reflection over noise, who was drawn to the sacred over the worldly, and who carried within him a light that those around him could sense even if they could not fully explain it. In Surah Al-An'am, "And we gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of whom we guided, and Noah we guided before, and among his descendants David and Solomon, and Job, and Joseph, and Moses, and Aaron. Thus do we reward the doers of good." Yusuf is named in this divine roll of honor, and his inclusion there was not accidental. It was the fulfillment of a promise that Allah had made to the family of Ibrahim generations before Yusuf was even born. The dream that started everything. Every great story has a moment that sets everything in motion, a single event from which all subsequent events flow. In the story of Yusuf, that moment came when he was still a young boy, and it came not in waking life, but in the world of dreams. He saw in his sleep a vision so vivid and so significant that it would shape the entire trajectory of his life. He saw 11 stars, and the sun, and the moon, all bowing down before him in prostration. When he woke, he carried this vision to the one person in his life who would understand its true meaning, his father Yaqub. And Yaqub, as a prophet who had been trained in the interpretation of divine signs, understood immediately what he was looking at. This was not an ordinary dream. This was a divine communication, a window into a future that Allah had already written and already guaranteed. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records the response of Yaqub to his beloved son. He said, "O my son, do not relate your vision to your brothers, or they will contrive against you a plan. Indeed, Satan to man is a manifest enemy." This was prophetic wisdom in its purest form. Yaqub did not dismiss the dream. He did not minimize it. He recognized its significance immediately and responded with the kind of careful, protective guidance that only a father who truly understood both the divine and the human could offer. The dream of Yusuf was real, its fulfillment was guaranteed, but its path to fulfillment would run through trials that no one in that household could yet imagine. The jealousy that consumed the brothers. The household of Yaqub was not a household without tension. He had 12 sons from different mothers, and among them, the bond between Yaqub and his two youngest sons, Yusuf and Benjamin, was visible and deep. This was not favoritism born of caprice. It was the recognition of a father who could see the divine light in his sons, particularly in Yusuf, and who responded to that light with the love and the attention it deserved. But the other brothers could not see what their father saw. What they saw was preference, and what preference produced in their hearts was a poison that would eventually consume their judgment entirely. In Surah Yusuf, Allah describes the inner world of the brothers with devastating accuracy. When they said, "Yusuf and his brother are more beloved to our father than we, while we are a clan. Indeed, our father is in clear error." These were not men who had been wronged in any material sense. They were men who had allowed envy to corrupt their perception until they could no longer see the truth clearly. They convinced themselves that their father's love for Yusuf was an error, that the light they could not understand must therefore be an injustice. And from that corrupted perception, a terrible plan began to form. The plot against a brother. The brothers of Yusuf gathered and debated among themselves what should be done. Some among them spoke of killing him outright. Others argued for a lesser harm. Eventually, they settled on a plan that they believed would accomplish their goal while leaving their hands relatively clean in the eyes of their father. They would take Yusuf out into the wilderness under the pretense of a day of recreation, and they would throw him into the darkness of a deep well, leaving him there to whatever fate awaited him. Then they would return to their father with a story, and the story would be that a wolf had come and devoured their beloved brother while they were not watching. In Surah Yusuf, the plan of the brothers is recorded with chilling clarity. Kill Yusuf or cast him out to some land so that your father's attention will be only for you, and you can be after that a righteous people. The tragic irony embedded in these words is almost unbearable. They spoke of becoming righteous people immediately after planning an act of profound cruelty against their own brother. This is what envy does to the human heart. It does not merely make a person cruel, it makes a person blind to their own cruelty and capable of wrapping injustice in the language of virtue into the darkness of the well. The brothers went to their father and asked him to allow Yusuf to come with them for a day of play in the open land. Yaqub was reluctant. He loved Yusuf deeply and was always watchful over him. But the brothers presented their case with apparent sincerity, and eventually Yaqub allowed his beloved son to go with them. They set out together, and when they reached the well in the wilderness far from home, they carried out their plan. They lowered Yusuf into the darkness of the well and left him there, alone in the dark, in the depths of a stone shaft with no way out and no one to call for help. And then they turned and walked away. What happened in those moments at the bottom of the well? What Yusuf felt, what he prayed, what passed through the heart of a young boy who had been brought here by the hands of his own brothers, is something that the human imagination can barely grasp. But Allah did not abandon him in that darkness. Allah never abandons his chosen ones in their darkest moments. In Surah Yusuf, Allah tells us something remarkable, and we inspired to him, you will surely inform them someday about this affair of theirs, while they do not perceive your identity. Even at the bottom of the well, even in the most complete darkness and helplessness that a child could experience, Allah was communicating with Yusuf, reassuring him, and already telling him about the future that awaited him. The darkness of the well was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The return to the father. The brothers killed a sheep and stained the shirt of Yusuf with its blood. Then they returned to their father in the evening, weeping with what they hoped would appear to be grief. They told Yaqub that a wolf had come while they were racing and had devoured his beloved son. They presented the blood-stained shirt as evidence. But Yaqub was a prophet, and a prophet cannot be easily deceived in the matters of the heart. He looked at the shirt, he looked at his sons, and he knew. In Surah Yusuf, his response stands as one of the most extraordinary statements of faith under pressure that the Quran records. He said, rather, your souls have enticed you to something, so patience is most fitting. And Allah is the one sought for help against that which you describe. He did not rage. He did not collapse. He turned entirely to Allah and chose the most difficult and most beautiful of responses, patience. And then he wept, and he continued to weep for years, because he was a father, and the grief of a father for a missing child is one of the most profound griefs that a human heart can carry. The caravan and the slave market. While Yaqub wept at home and the brothers lived with their lie, something was happening in the wilderness around the well. A caravan of travelers passing through the desert region stopped to draw water, and when they lowered their bucket into the well, something completely unexpected happened. And what they saw when they looked at him caused one of the travelers to cry out in astonishment. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records that moment. And there came a traveler, and they sent their water drawer, and he let down his bucket. He said, good news, here is a boy. And they concealed him merchandise, and Allah was knowing of what they did. The travelers concealed Yusuf and took him with them to Egypt, where they sold him in the slave market for a price that the Quran describes as few dirhams, a deliberately low and dismissive price that underscores the blindness of those who could not recognize the treasure they held in their hands. But what appeared to be the lowest point in the life of Yusuf was in reality the beginning of his rise. Every step he was forced to take away from his home was a step that Allah was directing toward a destination that would eventually change the lives of everyone connected to him. The house of Al-Aziz. Yusuf was purchased by a powerful man in Egypt, referred to in the Quran as Al-Aziz, who held a position of great authority in the royal household. This man brought Yusuf into his home. And from the very beginning, something about Yusuf distinguished him from every other servant or slave in the household. There was a quality in him that was impossible to ignore. A combination of intelligence, integrity, beauty, and a quiet dignity that set him apart from everyone around him. Al-Aziz recognized this quality and treated Yusuf with a degree of respect and trust that was unusual for someone in his position. In Surah Yusuf, Allah tells us that Al-Aziz said to his wife, "Make his residence comfortable. Perhaps he will benefit us, or we will adopt him as a son." And Allah was preparing Yusuf in this household for something far greater than either Al-Aziz or his wife could imagine. Every skill Yusuf developed, every lesson he learned, every quality that was refined through his years in that house was part of Allah's preparation of a man who would one day hold the economic fate of an entire nation in his hands. The greatest temptation, if the darkness of the world was the first great trial of Yusuf, then what happened in the house of Al-Aziz was the second, and in many ways, the more difficult of the two. The wife of Al-Aziz, a woman of beauty and power and position, developed a powerful desire for Yusuf. And one day she locked the doors and presented herself to him, demanding that he surrender to her. What happened in that moment defines the character of Yusuf more completely than perhaps any other event in his story. He refused, not because the temptation was not real, not because he was immune to human desire, but because his connection to Allah was stronger than any earthly pull. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records his response with, he said, "I seek refuge in Allah. Indeed, He is my master who has made good my residence. Indeed, wrongdoers will not succeed." In Surah Yusuf, Allah also tells us something that is profoundly important about the inner experience of Yusuf in that moment, and she certainly determined to have him, and he would have inclined to her had he not seen the evident sign of his Lord. This verse does not describe a man who felt nothing. It describes a man who felt the pull of temptation and overcame it through divine consciousness. That is not weakness. That is the highest form of human strength. The shirt torn from behind. As Yusuf fled and she pursued him, she grabbed at his shirt from behind, tearing. At that very moment, her husband Al-Aziz appeared at the door. She immediately shifted the narrative, accusing Yusuf of having approached her, demanding that he be punished. Yusuf declared his innocence. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records this crucial testimony. And a witness from her family testified, "If his shirt is torn from the front, then she has told the truth, and he is of the liars. But if his shirt is torn from the back, then she has lied, and he is of the truthful." The shirt was examined. It was torn from the back. The truth was established by physical evidence, and Al-Aziz acknowledged that Yusuf was innocent. But rather than restoring Yusuf to his full dignity and punishing his wife for her false accusation, Al-Aziz chose to manage the situation quietly. Justice was half served, and the injustice against Yusuf continued in a different form. The women of the city and the knife. The wife of Al-Aziz could not keep her feelings for Yusuf hidden, and word spread among the women of the city that she had been consumed by desire for her slave. They spoke of her in judgment and in gossip. When she heard what they were saying, she devised a plan to show them exactly why her feelings were what they were. She invited them to a banquet, gave each of them a knife for cutting fruit, and then brought Yusuf out before them. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records what happened with unforgettable vividness. "And when they saw him, they greatly admired him and cut their hands and said, 'Perfect is Allah. This is not a man. This is none but a noble angel.' The women who had been judging her in self-righteous gossip cut their own hands because they were so overwhelmed by what they saw that they lost control of themselves entirely. The wife of Al-Aziz then turned to them and said that this is the one for whom they had been blaming her, and that if he did not do what she commanded, he would be imprisoned. Yusuf heard this threat and responded with a supplication to Allah that reveals the extraordinary purity of his reliance on his Lord. In Surah Yusuf, he prays. He said, "My Lord, prison is more to my liking than that to which they invite me. And if you do not avert from me their plan, I might incline toward them and thus be of the ignorant." He chose prison over sin. He asked Allah for help not with the spirit of arrogance or self-sufficiency, but with the honest acknowledgement that he needed divine protection to remain on the straight path. This is Tawakkul in its most real and human form. The prison years. Despite his innocence, despite the evidence that had already established his truthfulness, Yusuf was thrown into prison. The powerful protect the powerful. And the truth of a slave, however evident, was not sufficient to overcome the will of those who held authority over his life. But Allah does not abandon his servants in prison any more than he abandoned Yusuf in the well. The prison became in Allah's perfect plan, not a punishment, but a preparation ground. In Surah Yusuf, Allah tells us, "And he who believed and said to the two of them, I will inform you of its interpretation before there comes to you your food with which you are provided. This is from what my Lord has taught me." Yusuf began interpreting dreams for his fellow prisoners, and his interpretations proved to be accurate. Two companions in the prison each had a dream, and Yusuf told them what each dream meant. One would be released and return to serving the king, and the other would be executed. He asked the one who would be released to remember him before the king and to speak of his case. But Surah Yusuf records what happened next with a verse that is both heartbreaking and profoundly instructive. But Satan made him forget the mention of his Lord to his master, so he stayed in prison several years. The man forgot. He returned to his life and his service and his comfort, and Yusuf remained in prison for several more years. But those years were not wasted. Every single day of that imprisonment was part of Allah's design, and the moment of release, when it finally came, would come in a way that would elevate Yusuf not merely to freedom, but to a position of power that no one in that prison cell could have imagined. The dream of the king. The king of Egypt had a dream that disturbed him deeply. He saw 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 thin ones, and 7 green ears of grain, and 7 others that were dry. He woke troubled and summoned his advisors, and none of them could provide a satisfying interpretation. It was at this moment that the cupbearer who had been in prison with Yusuf suddenly remembered the young man who had interpreted dreams with perfect accuracy. He went to Yusuf in the prison and asked him about the king's dream. In Surah Yusuf, Yusuf provided an interpretation of such clarity and practical wisdom that it went far beyond mere dream reading. Yusuf said, "You will plant for 7 years consecutively, and what you harvest leave in its grain, except a little from which you will eat. Then will come after that 7 difficult years, which will consume what you saved for them, except a little from which you will store. Then will come after that a year in which the people will be given rain and in which they will press." This was not merely an interpretation. This was an economic plan for the survival of a nation across 14 years of alternating abundance and famine. The king heard these words and immediately understood that this was no ordinary man. He summoned Yusuf from the prison, but Yusuf made a remarkable decision before he would agree to leave. Justice before freedom. He had been imprisoned for years on the basis of a false accusation, and he was not willing to walk out as though that accusation had never been made. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records this extraordinary moment. He said, "Return to your master and ask him what is the case of the women who cut their hands. Indeed, my Lord is knowing of their plan." The women were summoned. The wife of Al-Aziz, faced with the king's direct questioning, finally told the truth. In Surah Yusuf, she confesses. The wife of Al-Aziz said, "Now the truth has become evident. It was I who sought to seduce him, and indeed, he is of the truthful." Only after this public establishment of his innocence did Yusuf agree to leave prison. He had waited years. He had been patient through injustice that would have broken most people. And when freedom finally came, he insisted on receiving it with his honor fully restored, not merely his body freed. The rise to power. Yusuf came before the king, and the king was immediately struck by his presence, his wisdom, and the quality of his character. The king declared that Yusuf was, from that day forward, a man of established position and full trust in the royal court. In Surah Yusuf, he said to the king, "Appoint me over the storehouses of the land. Indeed, I will be a knowing guardian." He asked for the position himself. He did not wait to be assigned. He knew what he was capable of. He knew what the situation required. And he understood that humility does not mean pretending to have no ability, when ability is exactly what the crisis demands. In Surah Yusuf, Allah then records the completion of this elevation and thus re-established Yusuf in the land to settle therein wherever he willed. We touch with our mercy whom we will, and we do not allow to be lost the reward of those who do good. The boy who had been thrown into a well by his brothers. the young man who had been sold as a slave for a handful of coins, the innocent prisoner who had spent years behind bars for a crime he never committed. He was now the most powerful economic authority in all of Egypt, second only to the king himself. This is what Allah does for those who remain faithful to him through every darkness. The brothers returned. The famine that Yusuf had predicted came to pass exactly as he had described, and its reach extended far beyond the borders of Egypt. It reached the land where Jacob and his remaining sons lived. The brothers of Yusuf were sent to Egypt to seek provisions, and they came before the minister of the storehouses without knowing who he was. But Yusuf recognized them immediately. He knew his brothers standing before him, and in that moment the boy they had thrown into a well was now the man in whose hands rested their survival. He could have revealed himself immediately. He could have confronted them with the full weight of what they had done. Instead, he chose a more deliberate path, one that would allow him to bring his youngest brother Benjamin to Egypt and reunite the family completely before the full revelation. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records the beginning of this process, and Yusuf had put their goods back in their saddlebags. He said, "Bring me a brother of yours from your father." The brothers went back to their father and delivered the message. Yaqub was deeply reluctant to send his youngest son, the remaining born to Yusuf in his heart, into a distant land. But the necessity of the situation was undeniable. And eventually, with his heart heavy and his trust placed entirely in Allah, he allowed Benjamin to go. The plan to keep Benjamin. When the brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin, Yusuf welcomed them and secretly spent private time with his youngest brother, revealing his identity to him and asking him to keep the secret. Then he devised a plan that would allow him to keep Benjamin in Egypt without his brothers being able to refuse. He had the royal measuring cup placed in the bag of Benjamin, and when the brothers set out to leave, a call went out that the king's cup had been stolen and the caravan must be searched. The search was conducted, and the cup was found in the bag of Benjamin. The brothers were dismayed. They appealed and argued, but the law of the land, as they themselves had agreed to, required that the one in whose bag the stolen item was found must remain as a captive. In Surah Yusuf, the reaction of the brothers in that moment reveals how far their journey still had to go. They said, if he steals, a brother of his had stolen before. Even now, even in this moment of crisis, they reached back into the past to speak ill of Yusuf. They did not know they were standing before him. But Yusuf heard every word. In Surah Yusuf, Allah tells us, "So Yusuf kept it within himself and did not reveal it to them." Yaqub's grief and unwavering certainty. The brothers returned home without Benjamin and told their father what had happened. The grief of Yaqub reached a depth that it had not touched even in the darkest years of his mourning for Yusuf. He had lost Yusuf decades ago, and now Benjamin was gone. And in his grief, Yaqub said something that shocked and concerned his sons, something that revealed the extraordinary faith that had never left him for a single moment across all those years of pain. In Surah Yusuf, he said, "Rather your souls have enticed you to something, so patience is most fitting. Perhaps Allah will bring them to me all together. Indeed, it is He who is the knowing, the wise." He still believed after everything, after decades, after losing one son and now apparently losing another. He still believed that Allah would bring them all back together. This was not the optimism of a man who did not understand the situation. This was the certainty of a prophet who knew his Lord. And then he wept until his eyes turned white from grief, and his sons pleaded with him to stop, fearing for his health. And in Surah Yusuf, he gave them the answer that would define his legacy forever. He said, "I only complain of my suffering and my grief to Allah, and I know from Allah that which you do not know, the shirt and the restoration of sight." He told his sons to go back to Egypt and search for Yusuf and his brother, and not to despair of the mercy of Allah. And he told them something more, something that could not have come from ordinary human perception. In Surah Yusuf, he said, "Go and find out about Yusuf and his brother, and despair not of relief from Allah. Indeed, no one despairs of relief from Allah except the disbelieving people." The brothers went back to Egypt. This time when they stood before Yusuf, something had shifted. They were broken. The years had worn them down. The famine had depleted them, and they came before the minister of Egypt, not with the arrogance of men who had thrown a child into a well, but with the humility of men who had been humbled by life and by Allah. In Surah Yusuf, they said, "O exalted one, adversity has touched us and our family, and we have come with goods poor in quality. but give us full measure and be charitable to us. Indeed, Allah rewards the charitable. And it was in this moment of their humility that Yusuf finally revealed himself. He said to them the words that stand as the most powerful expression of prophetic forgiveness in the entire Quran. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records, He said, "Do you know what you did with Yusuf and his brother when you were ignorant?" In Surah Yusuf, He confirmed it. He said, "I am Yusuf, and this is my brother. Allah has certainly favored us. Indeed, he who fears Allah and is patient, then indeed Allah does not allow to be lost the reward of those who do good." The brothers were overwhelmed. They confessed. They acknowledged what they had done. And Yusuf, in a moment that demonstrates the absolute peak of human spiritual achievement, responded not with recrimination, not with punishment, not with the settling of scores, but with complete and unconditional forgiveness. In Surah Yusuf, he said, "You blame will there be upon you today. Allah will forgive you, and He is the most merciful of the merciful." Then He gave them His shirt and told them to cast it upon the face of their father, for it would restore his sight. The family reunited. The caravan set out from Egypt toward Canaan, and somewhere along the journey, before the brothers had even arrived home, Yaqub said something to those around him that they found difficult to believe. He said he could smell the scent of Yusuf. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records this moment. And when the caravan departed, their father said, "Indeed, I find the smell of Yusuf. If you do not think me weakened in mind." When the brothers arrived and cast the shirt of Yusuf over their father's face, in an instant the sight that had been taken from Yaqub by decades of weeping was restored. He could see again. And what he said in that moment of restoration was exactly what he had always said. A confirmation of the knowledge that Allah had given him and that he had never let go of even in his darkest hours. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records, He said, "Did I not tell you that I know from Allah that which you do not know?" The entire family then traveled to Egypt. They came before Yusuf, and the sun and the moon and the 11 stars of a childhood dream finally took their real form. In Surah Yusuf, Allah records the completion of the dream, and He raised his parents upon the throne, and they bowed to him in prostration. And he said, "O my father, this is the fulfillment of my vision of before. My Lord has made it reality." The dua of Yusuf, standing at the pinnacle of his worldly success, reunited with his family, his father's sight restored, his name cleared, his position established, Yusuf made a supplication to Allah that reveals the depth of his understanding of where everything he had came from. He did not attribute his rise to his own intelligence, his own patience, or his own endurance. He attributed everything to Allah. In Surah Yusuf, he prayed, "My Lord, you have given me your sovereignty and taught me of the interpretation of dreams. Creator of the heavens and earth, you are my protector in this world and in the hereafter. Cause me to die a Muslim and join me with the righteous." This is the prayer of a man who has seen the full arc of his life, from the bottom of a well to the throne of Egypt, and who understands with complete clarity that none of it was his own doing. Every door that opened, every hand that reached down into the darkness to pull him up, every moment of preservation through temptation and through imprisonment, and through the long years of separation from his father, all of it was Allah. And the greatest thing he could ask for at the end of it all was not more power, not more wealth, not more honor. It was to die as a Muslim and to be joined with the righteous. This is a spiritual summit of the story of Yusuf, and it is a summit that every believer is invited to aspire toward. The timeless lessons of Yusuf's story. The story of Yusuf is not merely a historical account. It is a living manual for the human soul navigating the world. It teaches us that the darkest pits are sometimes the beginning of the greatest rises. It teaches us that purity in the face of temptation is the highest expression of human strength. It teaches us that justice delayed by the powerful is not justice denied by Allah. It teaches us that the gifts of Allah, including beauty, intelligence, and position, are trust to be used in His service and not possessions to be hoarded for personal gain. It teaches us that forgiveness is not weakness, but the crown of spiritual achievement. And it teaches us that the dreams Allah plants in the hearts of His servants are real, and that their fulfillment, however impossible it may seem in the dark middle chapters of the story, is guaranteed by the one who wrote every chapter before the story began. In Surah Yusuf, Allah confirms this directly. There was certainly in their stories a lesson for those of understanding. Never was it a narration invented, but a confirmation of what was before it, and a detailed explanation of all things and guidance and mercy for the people who believe. The story of Yusuf is true. Every word of it is preserved in the Quran, and its lessons are as alive today as they were the day Allah revealed them, speaking directly to every soul that has ever sat at the bottom of a well, wondering if the dawn will ever come.